What is up, Flutter devs? I thought I'd bring you a little bit of flame war today, all the way over from Twitter. There was a tweet there that led to a response by me that then led to, who would have guessed it, many people disagreeing with me. And I wanted to talk about it in a video. I even brought wonderful flame war imagery, and I don't know if you can see it, but I've got a React t-shirt on just to trigger as many people as possible and to troll everybody. But we are here to talk about Flutter today. And in fact, why I think Flutter should make itself useful even in places where React currently does its job. And it all began with this tweet. Now this tweet, let me frame a few things here for you. I'm going to talk about a tweet that started with Tim. Nothing I say in this video is personal about anybody, including some of the people later where I'm going to kind of take them to task a bit more than I will with Tim. But I like Tim. Tim is great. I hope that when this virus stops killing people, Tim and I can go grab a coffee in Mountain View and argue in person about the future of Flutter. So none of this is personal. I'm actually putting together this video because there is an issue at play here that might not be obvious. It might seem like a small detail, but I think it turns out to be really important, and I'm going to talk about why that is the case. Let's begin with the initial tweet, which was not, Tim did not go out of his way to tweet this on its own. He was responding to somebody else who I believe was asking why Flutter's website is not built with Flutter. In his response, Tim says, quoting here, "Flutter is an app framework." I disagree with that. Flutter is an app framework, not a website framework. Building a content-heavy website? Question. Don't use Flutter, period. Please, period. Warning sign. Building an interactive app? Flutter all the way, exclamation, noisemaker. To which I responded, totally disagree. This may be difficult for you folks to read on a smaller screen, but I'll read it for you. Totally disagree. Flutter is a UI toolkit as opposed to an app framework, and it should provide great UI value on all rectangles for all UIs. Flutter's potential is precisely in the removal of arbitrary constraints like, quote, content heavy. If you can't paint text, you're not a UI toolkit. Now, admittedly, that last line was a little tongue-in-cheek. I know it's more than just painting text. And Tim let me have it in his response when he said, yeah, but building content-heavy websites is so much more than paint text. The web was built for document content and has 30 years of pedigree here with HTML, CSS, DOM API. Maybe one day will be a good fit for the CNN homepage, but certainly not today. His response to me was a little more promising in one regard. See, in Tim's first message, and this is the reason why I stopped to comment on it, I don't usually engage on Twitter. Engaging on Twitter is like inviting yourself to punch a wall because of what foolish people are saying on the other side of the world. I try to stay away. I put my content on Twitter so you can access it, but I can't deal with the arguments on Twitter. I see so many bad Flutter explanations on Twitter that I just can't deal with it. I have to stay away. But the reason that I dropped by to comment on this one is because the original message was so strong that it sounded to me like Tim was saying, Flutter isn't supposed to solve this problem. Flutter doesn't exist to do this. Don't expect this now or in the future. Now, are those the words that Tim said? No, they're not. That was me reading into it. But that was my concern. The message was so strong that it sounded to me like Tim was characterizing the purpose of Flutter, saying Flutter isn't supposed to render or to be able to deal with static, simple websites, blog posts, news websites, product pages, Wikipedia articles. In Tim's eventual response, he said, maybe one day we'll be a good fit for CNN, but not today. If that were the original post, I probably wouldn't even have paused to think about it or respond. I agree that Flutter is not there yet. And we'll talk a little more about that. I agree Flutter isn't there yet. The question is whether Flutter thinks that Flutter should eventually be there. Now, to you, you might say, well, of course it'll eventually get there. But wait until we look at some of the responses, because there are other people in this community that don't think Flutter should eventually get there, or that are very happy that Flutter isn't there. Let's look at a few of them. Or actually, first, let's add one more data point here. So Yegor responded. Yegor is essentially in charge of Flutter web development. So I've kept Tim and Yegor's face and handles visible because they are reps from the team. Everyone else, I'm going to put a black box over their face and their handle. But Yegor says, consider that you couldn't build this website with HTML, CSS 10 years ago. He's referring to Twitter. Nor could search engines crawl such a site. The cap is not placed on the future or Flutter. I don't know if that's supposed to be the future of Flutter or the future or Flutter. Anyway, but on today's ecosystem. Let's chat in a year, then again in 2 years. It's about ecosystem fit. It will change. This is still a bit more promising. This is softening the blow a little bit. This is saying, hey, maybe Flutter can do that. Maybe Flutter will do that. Let's wait and see. That's still not as strong of a message as I would like to see, but I get it. We're not there yet. Maybe we will be. I'm more or less okay with that. That's good. The bigger problem is when you look at people's responses to this. And this is my issue with Twitter. If you say the wrong thing, or if you say something in the wrong way, you can cause a cascade effect where a bunch of people come away with the wrong impression, and then they spread it to others. And I think we have some evidence that that has happened here. First, again, talking about the ridiculous social interactions on Twitter. This was some of the responses. Now, I just want to pause and reflect on how weird this is socially. So Tim says, Flutter isn't made for creating content-heavy websites. Don't use Flutter. Stay away. That's a statement about what Flutter cannot do. It's a negative statement, not negative emotionally, negative logically. Flutter does not do this. And that got responses that were energetic and positive. So true, exclamation, 100% true, thumbs up. It's funny because it's true. In what version of real life would people be happy that their tool can't do something? Doesn't that seem a little strange to you? I mean, only on Twitter. It might be true that Flutter can't do it, and we might accept that Flutter can't do it, but can you imagine being happy that Flutter can't do it? It doesn't make any sense. Twitter is crazy. It's a crazy place. But now let's talk about some specific responses and the fallacies within them. The reason I'm going through these is because you will come across a lot of arguments that sound like these. It's so easy to scroll through dozens of posts, read something in a couple of sentences, and come away thinking, yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, they're right about that. And that's very dangerous because most of the time they are wrong. They are so wrong. I just took a sampling of what was said to me, and I want to show you how wrong these things are. My hope is that when you then go to Twitter, I don't care what conclusion you draw, I don't care how you interact with Twitter, but I hope that you will be more critical in your own mind about what you read on Twitter. There are a lot of bad ideas and bad arguments. Let's look at just a few. One response to Tim said, in this case, I would use React or Vue instead of Flutter. No problem with that, by the way. That part's fine. Use whatever you want. But then he says, they are trying to solve current and future problems, but Flutter Web wants to solve problems that were solved years ago. On the surface, again, if you're scrolling through Twitter, sounds reasonable. Don't reinvent the wheel. Don't solve solved problems. But then again, if we dig a little deeper into this rationale, I guess this person believes that the entire world should use assembly for programming. Assembly solved the problem of controlling computers, right? Why? We don't need the C language. We never needed to invent C. We had assembly. And if we're going to invent the C language, we definitely don't need Java. But okay, if you want to have Java, the one thing we know for sure is that we definitely don't need Kotlin. Because all of these things are just reinventing programming languages. We already had a programming language. We don't need another one. We solved programming 50 years ago. We learned how to control computers 50 years ago. Even further than that, really, depending on where you want to put that point in history. But you see the fallacy here? The mistake is thinking that there's ever only one problem. The problem that C was solving, the C language, was solving the problem of humans building large and complex systems for computers. Technically possible with assembly, but in practice, absolutely chock full of mistakes and incomprehensibility. C made those systems tractable, less error prone, more extensible. Moving to Java, we said, hey, instead of humans managing computer memory, how about computers manage computer memory? When we got to Kotlin, the difference there was a lot less, but Kotlin is once again an attempt to help humans do a better job of controlling computers effectively, building large, robust, low-bug systems. Really apps more so than systems. There was a reason for every one of those programming languages to exist. Now, in another tweet, this person said that he's not against Flutter, but actually this tweet suggests that he is. Because what was the early version of Flutter about? The early version of Flutter was about solving rendering on Android and iOS. But Android and iOS already solved the rendering on Android and iOS. Why would Flutter need to resolve that problem? Unless, of course, Flutter was making development an order of magnitude easier. Unless Flutter was making the entire UI portable so that you could cut your labor costs by 50%. Unless those were the problems that Flutter was solving. So now take Flutter into the browser. It's a continuation of solving the same problems. Just like Flutter solved those problems on Android and iOS, now Flutter is solving them in the browser. But yes, bringing Flutter into the browser, bringing the universality of Flutter into the web experience requires that a bunch of the things that you do on web be re-implemented by Flutter. Just like Flutter had to re-implement a bunch of things on Android and iOS. Go look at text input. Now, Flutter still uses the input method engine from the mobile OS. But look at how much rework of text input Flutter has to do so that your little text field works correctly in Flutter. There's a lot of reinvention, but it's for a very important purpose. So what sounded like a reasonable objection when you're scrolling through Twitter turns out to be grossly misguided. This is someone who's not thinking about what they're saying. This is not a good argument at all. Let's move on. Here we have a tweet that says, SpaceX rockets don't exist to go to our neighbor. However, I don't think it's a very troublesome cap on SpaceX's rocket potential. The main purpose of Flutter is to create interactive UI apps, not command line apps, nor static content-heavy websites. And we've got a few different problems going on here. First, the metaphor doesn't make any sense. There's a few ways the metaphor can go, but none of them work. First, if we're going to use SpaceX rockets as a comparison, the metaphor would be like this. I invest in SpaceX, and then I tell you, I want to go to the moon. And you tell me, no, you can't go to the moon. SpaceX rockets only go to Mars. And I say, what are you talking about? It's way easier to get to the moon than it is to get to Mars. Just drop me off at the moon. And they say, no, these rockets only go to Mars because they're made for Mars. And this company wants to go to Mars, and we refuse to consider the moon. But rockets are just escape vehicles. Rockets are just tools to get out of Earth's atmosphere. You should be able to go anywhere you want beyond the Earth. It would be really weird to tell investors and people purchasing tickets, those who want to support SpaceX, that they can't go to the moon, that they won't accept money to go to the moon. They won't even consider it because these rockets are only going to Mars. That would be very strange. And that's actually what Flutter is doing. We'll get more into that weirdness later with some examples. Then the next part. The main purpose of Flutter is to create interactive UI apps. Well, I don't know what an interactive UI app is. Is that supposed to distinguish something? I don't know what that means. Literally everything on a computer is interactive. If you want an interface that's not interactive, you can pick up a book, but that's about it. The bigger issue here, though, is I'm trying to debate the purpose of Flutter. I'm trying to say, I think the purpose of Flutter is to be a UI toolkit, which means all user interfaces are fair game. So telling me what Flutter's purpose is when I'm trying to discuss Flutter's purpose isn't an argument at all. That's just a conclusion. You're just telling me that you're right and I'm wrong. It's not very helpful. It doesn't show us any new information. It doesn't make an argument. And then there's CLIs. I never brought up CLIs. I don't think anybody else did either. That's kind of a non sequitur. And then we get to static, content-heavy websites. More words that don't really mean anything. First, let's start with static. What does static mean? Well, static is in opposition to dynamic. Either something is static or it's dynamic. Dynamic means it changes. Static means it doesn't. If you can render a layout that changes up to 60 times per second, I promise you, you can render that same layout at 0 times a second. In other words, if something is static, if you take a layout that's static, it is by definition easier to render and deal with than the dynamic version. So the fact that something is static really doesn't matter. Then we get to content heavy. Again, I'm not sure what this means. We could take a guess, but I'll show you some examples later that I think demonstrate this is not so clear at all. So once again, we have an argument supposedly in opposition to what I said that turns out to not really be an argument at all if you just pause and look at what's written. How about this? I don't expect this to change in the next few years, meaning the overall ecosystem situation on web and web versus Flutter on web and things like that. I don't expect this to change in the next years. There are great web frameworks that ship static content rendered on the server. Pick the right tool for the job. There is no silver bullet. Again, a number of problems here. We start with fatalism. You're welcome to predict whatever you want for the future. But pretending like we don't have any control over the future is kind of silly. Where did all of today's tools come from? Like, did God come down and say, here are your tools, these are all you get? Or did developers say, this isn't very convenient over here. This isn't the way I think things should be, so I'm going to build what I think should exist. I think we should all avoid fatalism. I think we should embrace the power that we have to contribute to Flutter and contribute to the ecosystem of packages and plugins. Nothing is set in stone. And up to this point, Flutter has enjoyed immense growth and popularity. Why can't we continue that? Why can't we make it the last 5%? And I do think it is about 5%. I think we're about 95% to having a ubiquitous UI toolkit that could at least be nominally used, reasonably used for any user interface at all. We have about 5% remaining. Why be fatalistic about that? Let's just go get it done. Let's go figure it out. Let's say we're almost there and we're going to get to the finish line. You're allowed to be fatalistic, but I don't think it's in our best interest to be that way. I'll come back to server-side rendering in the next tweet. Then he says, pick the right tool for the job. This is a lot like when your colleague looks at your code and they just say, don't repeat yourself. The dry principle. Or they say, Yagni, you ain't going to need it. Those things aren't arguments, they're conclusions. When you tell someone, use the right tool for the job, are you under the impression that I was consciously choosing the wrong tool for the job? Did I sit down today and say, you know what? I think today I'm going to use the wrong tool for the job. And then you're like, wait a second. Don't forget, use the right tool for the job. Oh, that's right. I was going to use the wrong tool, but you reminded me I should use the right tool. Now, I'm being really flippant, but I think this kind of comment deserves a flippant response. Just to be honest with you, I don't care about this. I'm not losing sleep over any of this. I don't take any of this personally. But when you're communicating with colleagues, you should be careful with the conclusions. You should be careful with kind of being condescending to someone who's trying to discuss a nuanced point. Obviously, if I thought that Flutter was fundamentally the wrong tool for the job, I wouldn't suggest that we use it. But it gets even worse. Returning to my earlier point, what I'm talking about in this conversation is what we should turn Flutter into. Obviously, if we make Flutter work for all the web use cases, then by definition, Flutter would be the right tool. And then this point goes away. No matter which way you cut it, this isn't helpful. Followed by the next truism, there is no silver bullet. Okay, what is that argument? What's the new information that's made available? How does this help me understand your point of view? A silver bullet for what? Let's start with that question. A silver bullet for what problem? If the problem is the ability to reuse the same skill set on absolutely any user interface in the world on any rectangle, then yes, there is a silver bullet. It's called Flutter. If you mean some kind of technology that solves absolutely every developer problem for every developer in the world, everywhere, all the time, okay, you got me on that one. There's no silver bullet. But how does this relate to the conversation? What is the argument supposed to be? What I'm saying is that Flutter can and should make it possible to ship CNN's homepage built with Flutter. I think Flutter can do that. I think it can get there. I think we can get Flutter to that point. I think we should. I think that is well within Flutter's purpose. And I don't know that we need to worry about silver bullets. All right, and I think this is the last one. This goes into the server-side rendering part. Especially server-side rendering is almost impossible by design with Flutter. Different screen sizes produce different DOMs. You can't easily ship a pre-rendered HTML file to users and hydrate it in the client. The first sentence is correct, and that's why the rest of this comment is unnecessary. I'll reread the first sentence. Server-side rendering is almost impossible by design with Flutter. Cool. End of story. No server-side rendering necessary. See, the key word in server-side rendering is the word server. Different things request information from your server. Sometimes it's a search engine robot. Now, when a search engine robot asks your server for a document or a page or whatever, your server is responsible for serving that to the robot. Think about your standard Ruby on Rails web controller, because there seem to be a lot of people that have at one point or another dealt with such a controller. What does that controller know how to do? Well, that controller knows how to take the incoming request and parse it. That controller is aware of your databases, document database, relational database, flat files, whatever. That controller is able to query your database or file system, accumulate all the relevant information, package it into a response, and send it back to the client. That's what every Ruby on Rails controller ever did, right? So if you need to send data to a search engine, shouldn't your server be pretty good at doing that? I don't know why we need to involve Flutter in this conversation. Shouldn't your server be able to serve information to the search engine robot? I think so. I think when a robot asks for content, your server can give the robot content. And then when a user asks for content from the browser, you can give the user a user interface, and Flutter can paint it. Using server-side rendering as a reason why Flutter can't or shouldn't be used for a marketing page, a Wikipedia article, a news website, that's expecting Flutter to do something that no UI toolkit actually has the fundamental responsibility to handle. Now, some people down in the comments are going to say, oh, but what about React? What about Vue? They do server-side rendering. I can't tell you why they combine those two things, but those responsibilities are not the same. A user interface knows how to paint pixels for the human eye and to interpret user gestures and keyboard input. That's a user interface. There's no need to combine that with how to communicate with search engine robots. Let's keep Flutter in the area of user interfaces, and we can completely avoid issues like this. Now, that's the last tweet I'm going to go over. And again, the reason I went over these, I'm not trying to be pedantic. I'm not trying to pick on these people. I'm going through these because this is a pattern on Twitter. The kind of flowing river of really poorly thought out counter arguments, the counter arguments that aren't really arguments. And as a result, I think what tends to happen is that people quickly run through the thread, and instead of reading each argument, they try to get a rough approximation of the number of people for something and the number of people against something, and then they draw a conclusion. I just want to point out what happens when you do that. You likely would have gone right through these posts, accepted them at face value, and you very well may have come away with the wrong conclusion. Now, you're still free to draw whatever conclusion that you'd like, but I hope you understand how easy it would be to think that these are good arguments when they really aren't. And this is why, in general, you won't see me on Twitter. This is why you can't have a debate on Twitter. It just doesn't work. But now let me get into a few thoughts on this issue in general. Up to this point in Flutter's life, what Flutter has done primarily is take Android and iOS developers and free them to extend their products into desktop and web, so that probably for the most part, Flutter web developers are historically, their personal professional history is probably app development elsewhere that they extended into the browser because they could. And that's great. That's actually a very good thing that for the Flutter tool to help the world do. But I think pretty soon that adoption curve is going to be complete. Pretty soon we're going to need to make a good argument for why people who come from web or people who are just getting into web should choose Flutter. And I want to show you, when someone comes to investigate Flutter, I want to show you the kind of thing that's going to happen. We can start with, let's say our friends over at Rive. Rive has created a really impressive 2D vector graphics, real-time animation suite. And at least it was, although I hope it still is, all rendered with Flutter. Now the scene I'm sure is rendered with their own technology, but the app, everything around that scene, I believe is rendered with Flutter. And so what the message that new developers are going to receive is that, hey, you can build a real-time 2D vector graphics animation suite with Flutter. But God forbid you build CNN's homepage. That's really where things get complicated. Am I right? Now, I understand that there are nuanced technical reasons why this happens to be the case right now. I get it. What I'm pointing out here is that someone who doesn't know the depths of Flutter, they aren't going to get it. This is a marketing message that I don't think is ever going to make sense if we want to recruit people from the web. And we should want to. The world of app development, UI more specifically, the world of UI development is pretty much just Android, iOS, and web. Obviously, there are some things on the desktop, but those tend to be rather specialized use cases. For the most part, all UI developers in the world are Android, iOS, or web. It's a pretty big deal if we are not going to make Flutter appetizing to developers on the web. And this juxtaposition right here is a major red flag to anybody who is considering Flutter. This comparison it's so shocking that I think it reasonably leads someone to conclude that there is something way off in Flutter. Of course, there isn't something way off. The thing that prevents us from creating CNN's homepage is a small number of relatively small problems. When you consider the scope and scale of problems that Flutter has solved up to this point, those problems are relatively small. But they're keeping us from getting there. And so we end up in this situation. You can build an amazing 2D vector graphics animation program, but you can't build a simple website of articles. I don't think we want this line to be there. And what's probably more important to recognize is that the precise location of this line is really ambiguous. Let's talk about that. Here's Gmail, a Gmail inbox. Now, this very much looks like an app, right? We have our app bar at the top with the hamburger icon, the app icon, search icon buttons. Our primary content is a vertical list of what might be list tiles in Flutter. We could build most of this UI in 30 minutes with Flutter. No big deal. So is Gmail an interactive UI app? Based on this, one might say yes, but then you go to compose an email. Now, this email can contain headers, paragraphs, ordered lists, unordered lists, horizontal rules, images. The email can contain an entire document, not unlike an article on CNN's website, not unlike a blog post. So is this an interactive UI app, or is this content heavy? Are we allowed to create this with Flutter, or are we, as the original tweet said, essentially prohibited? Don't do it. Don't go there. Stay away. Or are you telling me that somehow I should build the inbox with Flutter and then defer to an entirely different stack of technologies to compose an email? It's not clear to me what the story is here. How about Notion? Notion literally has an Android and iOS app. They're called apps. They're app binaries. It's also on the web. If this mock-up is any indication, it's also on desktop. Certainly seems interactive to me, and there are app related things in here. But then again, the purpose of Notion is to create a bunch of documents. Again, headers, paragraphs, ordered lists, unordered lists, to-do lists, images, videos. And not only is it laid out vertically, but the user can partition things horizontally into columns. It's a rather sophisticated layout system. Is this an interactive UI app? Or is this content heavy? Sure seems like there's a lot of content to me. But it's also definitely an app. And it's definitely interactive. And it definitely has a user interface. How about Slack? Slack seems like even more of an app than Notion. More app-style nav, a docked pane over on the right, chat messages. We're all used to our chat apps, right? It's got to be an app. Except if you go to put a message down there in the chat, you'll find that once again, you can write paragraphs, ordered lists, unordered lists. You can use bold, italics, underline. You can embed links. You can embed images. Is that an interactive UI app, or is that content heavy? And imagine just for a moment, in your mind, imagine that we sent a message with all of that complex content, an image, a header, paragraphs, and list items into this chat. Compare what appears on the screen in Slack to CNN's homepage. What is it about Slack that makes it an interactive UI app that is not content heavy versus the CNN page, which also has headers, images, and text, but that page is content heavy? I think the reason this line is so difficult to articulate is because it's totally imaginary. There isn't actually a natural difference here. Both of these things are user interfaces. They paint pixels and they process gestures, and then they do everything in between. There's no fundamental reason to pretend that Slack is something that Flutter should paint and CNN's homepage isn't. In fact, I think this runs counter to Flutter's history, and I'll talk about that very briefly. Going back to the earlier days of Flutter, and I'm not talking necessarily about the intention of the organization, but I'm going to talk about Flutter's early popularity. Flutter looked out at the world and it said, hey, a bunch of you are building things for rectangle A in your hand, handheld rectangle A, and a bunch of you are building things for handheld rectangle B. But you're separate. You use separate languages, separate APIs. You go to separate conferences. You're often on separate teams. There's an imaginary line between you, and it doesn't need to be there. It's not a real line. It's not a physical line. There's no physical reason that you have to be separated and segregated, but you are. So we're going to create Flutter. And Flutter is going to erase the imaginary line so that now you can build products on any handheld rectangle. No more line. Erase the imaginary line. And then Flutter said, you know what? There's this imaginary line between handheld rectangles and the really big rectangles. And it sure doesn't seem like that line needs to be there either. Let's erase that imaginary line. Let's take Flutter development across all handheld rectangles and all desktop rectangles. And then finally, Flutter started to say, you know, between those platform rectangles and browser rectangles, there's an imaginary line. We think we should erase that line too. But then Flutter hit a snag. Then Flutter did kind of the one thing you wouldn't expect. Flutter created its own imaginary line. Flutter said, do the things on the left, not the things on the right. Go build interactive UI apps, but don't build static content heavy web pages. Flutter installed its own imaginary line. And I hope I've convinced you by this point that it is imaginary. There's no obvious, concrete, natural divider for this line. It's arbitrary. It's based on what Flutter happens to be able to do today. And I'm okay with that. I'm okay with the knowledge that Flutter does not yet do everything on web. And I don't think I've said anything to the contrary. Flutter only moves as fast as it moves. I mean, I spent 2 years on the team being a part of the effort to move it forward. I get it. That's not the problem. My problem is when people suggest that this line is supposed to be here. That Flutter's purpose is to install that line. That Flutter should never get beyond that line. That it's not Flutter's job, it's not Flutter's purpose, it's not Flutter's goal. That people are thumbs upping, they're getting excited about the fact that Flutter won't do the things on the right. That's where I have a problem. That's where I feel the need to create a video to say something about this. I don't care if Flutter isn't there yet, but Flutter should absolutely make it its mission to get there. There is no fundamental reason to install this line. There is no fundamental reason in the future, in the eventuality, there is no reason to differentiate between interactive UI apps and static content-heavy web pages. At the end of the day, there is a web browser rectangle, and I am trying to paint the pixels and receive gestures in that rectangle. We are installing a distinction that shouldn't make a difference. Flutter should be against segregation like this. Because as I've shown you, Flutter's history and popularity up to this point has been based on erasing imaginary, arbitrary division, not creating them. And we're so close. We're so close. Flutter is like 95% to erasing all of those lines everywhere. This is the last one. This is the only line left to erase. Let's erase it. Okay, it takes 6 months. Okay, it takes a year. Fine, but let's erase it. Let's get past it. Let's overcome it. Let's make Flutter useful for absolutely every browser-based user interface. And I'll finish with this. Flutter value propositions. Here's the one that everybody already knows and understands. Flutter gives us portable products. One language, one set of APIs, one code base, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different products. Flutter's adoption by businesses is based on this value proposition. CEOs and CTOs and directors understand this value proposition from start to finish. You're telling me that I can cut down labor costs by up to 80%? Yeah, I think I'm on board. But what if I told you this is only half the story? What if I said this is only half of Flutter's value proposition? In fact, all things considered, this is the lesser of the two. The other value proposition is portable skills. Portable skills. So on the one hand, for the portable products, for the first value proposition, I tell you that you can skip building the web version of your product because Flutter will automatically go to web. That's a portable product. Portable skills is me telling you, you don't have to learn HTML, CSS, JavaScript, document object model, box layout, NPM, Node, and Webpack. Forget building with them. I'm saying you don't have to learn them. What's the value in that? How much time would it honestly, assume you're not one of those developers. For those of you that are, of course you're not going to care. You've already invested the time. But the rest of the world hasn't necessarily done that. And the future generations haven't done that. So for the people that haven't learned those things yet, when I tell you that you can learn Dart and Flutter, and by doing so, you can avoid learning HTML, CSS, JavaScript, a document object model, box layout, NPM, Node, and Webpack, what's that worth? The time it takes to learn web development is much longer than the time it takes to build a web product. Well, what was the first value proposition? The first value proposition was you don't have to build the web product. If that's valuable, then never having to learn the web stack is like 100 times more valuable than that. But there's a caveat for portable skills. It only works if it's universal. There can't be any big exceptions. Think about Android. And I'm talking about app developers now. So obviously I am someone who also, I work on packages, I work on plugins. My work and my life is a little bit different. But put your mind in that of an app developer using Flutter. Imagine that app developer, they reach a point where they can't quite do something with Flutter and they can't find a plugin for it. And so suddenly they have to drop down from Flutter into the world of Android APIs. That is a nightmare situation, right? Why? Because the moment that you have to drop down to the Android level, almost no matter how small your task, you must immediately understand activities and their life cycle, fragments and their life cycle, view hierarchies and their life cycle, services and their life cycle, content providers and their life cycle, and intents. And that's just step one. Because you probably went down there to do something like Bluetooth communication or push notifications or user location services. I haven't even included that yet. You can't even get into those until you learn all the things that I just listed. That's the problem with holes in the portable system. You truly need to be able to ship entire products over and over again, many different projects. You need to be able to escape the underlying platform if portable skills are going to be valuable. Obviously, some of us always have to go down to that level. If we're going to build plugins, we've got to go figure it out. But why do we build plugins? We build them so that other people don't have to. And the more that Flutter matures, the more that we find people can build entire apps using Flutter and open source plugins, and they never have to understand the underlying platform. Not needing to learn Android app frameworks, not needing to learn iOS app frameworks, not needing to learn the entire web stack. This is immense value. This is at least half of what makes Flutter valuable. But it only works if it's true. If I happen to work on a Flutter project for web and thereby avoid all the web stuff, but then the next project I work on, Flutter says, no. Flutter isn't made for that. Go use something else. You've just defeated that entire value proposition. For me as a developer, you just ruined the value proposition. Because if I'm going to work on web, and you're going to make me learn HTML, CSS, JavaScript, the DOM, box layout, NPM, Node, and Webpack, if you're going to make me learn all that, why would I also learn Flutter? I could just add Vue on top. I could just add React on top or Angular. That's a true argument. If you have to learn all that web crap, then why not just stick with it? This is the argument for which Flutter currently has no answer, but it can. The answer is make Flutter applicable to all user interfaces in the browser, the way it is for all user interfaces on Android, iOS, Mac, Windows, and Linux. Then Flutter lives up to its potential. Then Flutter has completed a global UI revolution. But that's the difference. If you believe that's not Flutter's job, then that revolution will never complete. We'll never actually get there. That's why it's important. That's why I'm asking you to believe, to agree that this is what Flutter should do. Today, tomorrow, next year, whatever, but this should be part of Flutter's purpose. It is in all of our interest to get to that destination. If we do, Flutter will have far more of a profound positive impact on the world than it would if it doesn't. That's why I stopped to comment on Twitter. That's why I created this video. I guess I'll leave it there.